Chapter 6. Not only will we abstain from all interferences with your slaves, but we will, with an iron hand, crush any attempted insurrection on their part. From the Proclamation to the People of West Virginia, May 26, 1861, General George B. McClellan, Union Army. Easter put her hands around Jason's shoulders as they watched Obie bring the mules with the wagons out of the barn. "We see you soon, Jason. Don't cry now," she said, wiping his face. The hot, humid air was heavy. "You and Obie coming back?" She bent down and kissed him on the forehead, her voice cracking. "We'll be back soon." Easter climbed behind Obie on one of the mules, and Wilson mounted the other. Jason wavered, his small mouth quivering as he tried not to cry. Martha came out of the kitchen and stood behind him. Easter waved and looked back until she could no longer see Jason and Martha in the gathering dust. Obie knew that this was the last they'd see of the Jennings farm. He didn't know how, but they'd get to Bucca tonight. "I know something wrong, Obie," Easter said softly. "I feel it all day." She held him tightly around his waist. Because of the wagon clanging noisily down the road, their words were hidden from Wilson, who rode behind. "How we get to the creek now?" she asked. "We find some way. Now I see why Wilson rushes to work so hard." Easter squirmed. "We never work in the field at Master Philip's," she sighed. "Obie, it take 3 weeks for the cotton crop to be picked. This way they make some of the money they would from hiring us out in the winter." "They have us sold before the soldiers come back," Obie said. His head swirled. He had no idea how they'd be able to sneak off the closely guarded plantation. "Maybe we find someone there who'll help us get to Bucca, or tell Bucca where we are." "But we have to get Jason too," she reminded him. He hadn't thought about Jason. "We have to sneak back to the house to do that. Get caught for sure." The road began to widen, and he sensed Wilson moving up to ride alongside. "We'll talk later," he whispered. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The closer they got to George Philip's 300 acres of land, the more determined Obie became to find a way to leave. When they rode through the gates of the plantation, they saw a group of men standing on the lawn. George Phillips was talking with them. "They soldiers?" Easter asked. Obie strained to see. "I think so." He thought he recognized the gray Confederate caps. Normally their wagons would have been met at the gate by one of Phillips's people. Tonight, however, small groups of slaves watched the men talking, keeping a careful distance from them. Phillip's face was as somber as his black suit. "What the devil's going on?" Wilson mumbled. When they climbed off their mules, Jesse, the overseer, who brought the news about Tyler, spotted them. He walked across the lawn. "Hello, sir," he said to Wilson. Then he motioned with his hand toward the soldiers. "The family sees so much trouble. Now this." Wilson placed his hand on the mule's neck. "What happened?" Jessie shook her head. "Jeremiah tried to run off to them Yankees instead of watching out for young Tyler like he's supposed to." He spread his thin mouth in a grin. "But them Yankees trick him, send him right back here. Tell our soldiers that they ain't frightening this war to steal nobody's property." Obie's heart raced as he stared at the cluster of men on the lawn. Now he recognized a tall figure, his hands tied behind him. "Jeremiah," he said to himself. He and Easter glanced at each other. She too realized what this meant. Running to the Yankee soldiers wasn't the way to freedom. Obie wished he could talk to Jeremiah, find out what his plan had been and why it hadn't worked. Wilson and Jessie started toward the tobacco barn. Obie and Easter followed, leading the mules. As they passed the soldiers, Obie tried to catch Jeremiah's eyes, but Jeremiah's head was thrown back. He looked defiant, standing straight and tall, and seeming to stare at the dark, starless sky. "That boy going to suffer now," Jessie said. "Master Phillips don't allow no beatin' 'less someone real bad, and that's a bad one." Wilson spat on the ground. "Wish I was back on the sea. Sick to death of war, sick to death of slaves and dirt." They passed the smokehouse where meat was cured and stored. Obie tried to block out the men's conversations so that he could think. He had to figure out a way to meet Bucca tonight. They walked by the spinning house, and Obie heard the women inside laughing and talking softly as they spun the cotton thread that would be woven into cloth. It was a familiar sound, and a comforting at a time when things were changing rapidly. He would like to stay there and listen a while longer. When they reached the tobacco barn, a young woman came out to help unload the leaves from the wagons. As soon as one of the wagons was empty, Wilson turned to Jessie. "I'll be back tomorrow for that other wagon and mule," he said. Obie wished he could take the mule himself and ride away with Easter. "You stay in the log cabin tonight," Jessie said to Obie. Obie looked surprised. "I ain't staying with Thomas, sir?" "You working in the field, not with the carpenter." "Sir, I thought I could stay with Thomas in the cabin." Obie kept after the overseer because he didn't want to be in the long cabin with a lot of other men. "You stay where you told to stay," Wilson told him. He turned to Jesse. "He give you any trouble, you put him on that whipping post. Watch him good." The overseer winked. "He'll be safe here." Obie felt trapped as he took another bundle of tobacco to the barn. It would be almost impossible to get away without the help of one of the Phillips's people. Though he knew many of the slaves, he didn't know if he could trust any. Who would help him without turning him in before he even got to Buka? "The gal can stay in the nursery," Jesse told Wilson. The nursery was a cabin for children who had no mothers. During the day it was used for the babies belonging to the women who worked in the fields. They were cared for while their mothers worked. Two old women who could no longer labor as field hands took care of the children. Easter stared at the ground. Usually she stayed with the cook's helper in a small shed behind the kitchen of the family house. Wilson got on the mule and rode off without looking back. The women who had been working in the barn were leaving. "You all go to the cabins," Jesse said to Obie and Easter. "Curfew's starting now, and the horn will be blowing at 5 in the morning." He walked away from them, heading in the direction of the far pasture. Obie guessed that he was going to find out what happened to Jeremiah, who was by now probably in the plantation jail on the outskirts of the property. As soon as the overseer was out of earshot, the women began to talk. One of them put her hands on Easter's shoulders. "Why you here in July?" She didn't wait for an answer, but continued talking. "You see they bring Jeremiah back?" They started walking toward the cabins. "Jeremiah, fool," the short woman walking next to Obie said, "believe in them stories he hear about soldiers coming to free us." The large white two-story plantation house loomed over them as they passed it on the way to the slave quarters. The lawn was clear of people now. Behind the house, a footpath bordered with cypress and magnolia trees led away from the house. Easter was on the verge of tears as they approached the quarters. There were 2 rooms of one-room log cabins that faced each other, 17 on each side of a narrow path. People sat talking in front of and in the narrow alleys between the cabins. Some of them sat around small fires. Ordinarily by now most of them would be inside after the grueling field work. They'd eat, do their chores, and sleep early. Though barely a sound could be heard, Obie guessed they were talking about Jeremiah. The women who had walked with Easter and Obie joined different groups of people. Obie put his arm around Easter's shoulders. "We'll find a way," he said. "Buka ain't going to leave without us. He leavin' to show us the way. Otherwise he stay right here." Easter gazed at the small fires and the people huddled around them. "I don't like staying in these cabins. I could be with Rose in the shed or at the farm with Jason and Mistress." Obie sighed. "Wherever you be, you still a slave."